This is lecture 4.2, Ethnocentrism and Subcultures. In this lecture, we expand on some of the ideas closely related to our lecture on culture, but we cover these ideas that are very important. This will probably be a relatively short lecture, but these are incredibly important concepts. So first, ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism occurs when a person uses their own culture as a standard to evaluate another group or individual, leading to the view that another culture's way that they do things are different or abnormal. The most common type of ethnocentrism that we have in the United States is called Eurocentrism. This is a type of ethnocentrism that overemphasizes European cultures. So in the United States, in places like Canada, in Europe itself, in Australia, places that have been typically dominated by people with European ancestors, these are places where Eurocentrism most typically is present. Cultural relativism, then, is the opposite to ethnocentrism. That's a relatively fair thing to say. Cultural relativism is the process of understanding another culture on their own terms rather than judging according to one's own culture. This is a very important idea in the social sciences, in sociology and anthropology especially, because we do study groups that are different from our own. And when studying any group, it is important to employ cultural relativism because it helps sociologists see others more objectively. You can't really understand the way people are behaving unless you understand their culture itself. In the first part of, in the 1800s and the first part of the 1900s, anthropologists and sociologists were particularly bad about not being culturally relativistic in their studies. As a result, those very old studies are actually next to worthless to us now because they are not documenting the way that those peoples lived. They were documenting their Eurocentric perception of those people. And we could also commit those errors in the modern day, but hopefully a sociologist or anthropologist is better than that now. So let's talk about dominant culture, subculture, and countercultures. A dominant culture then, and this is a whole new set of ideas, refers to the values, norms, and practices of the group within society that has the most power, wealth, prestige, status, and influence in our society. In our society, the group with those things, now we're talking about the United States as a whole, not necessarily New Mexico, are rich old white people. Those are the people that dominate the culture. If you've traveled outside of your region, I actually was struck by the way the dominant culture actually is a little bit lessened in New Mexico. But outside of New Mexico, it is rich old white dudes dominant culture, which is actually one of the reasons I love New Mexico. But yeah, it's those groups of people. Typically, also the dominant culture is predominantly Christian, and historically, a very specific version of Protestant Christianity is the dominant culture in the United States. A subculture, then, is a group within society that is differentiated by its distinctive values, norms, and lifestyles. So those terms, values and norms, go back to our previous lecture 4.1. So a subculture is a group that has different ideas and different aesthetics, but does not directly challenge the dominant culture. So a goth subculture, that's particularly late 90s, early 2000s goth subculture. Or Detroit Red Wings hockey fans. These are both groups of people that don't really challenge the status quo of society, but they have different aesthetics of what they think are, fun and the way to do things and all that. Now, a counterculture is a group within society that openly rejects and or actively opposes society's values and norms. A counterculture is in direct opposition to the dominant culture. We have two historic examples here, and I use these historic examples because it transitions into my next point. Ku Klux Klan members, these are people who absolutely oppose equal treatment of people based on their race. These are countercultural characters now in our society, where our ideal culture is that of equal opportunity for people based on race. They are countercultural now, but at one time, at one place in the Southeast, during the, let's call it 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and a bit further, they were part of the dominant culture. But as society changed, they shifted into the counterculture. The other picture are of anti-Vietnam War protesters. Those people were, at their beginning, very countercultural. It was part of the dominant culture to assume that part of your patriotic duty is to support the military no matter what. And that still exists to this day in our society. But the idea that the Vietnam War was not a good and just war, that war shouldn't have happened, that was very countercultural when the anti-Vietnam protests started. Over time, we came as a society to think of that war as not one of the good wars. And as a result, it really shifted. And now these anti-Vietnam protesters are almost like the definition of peaceful protesters, and actually really prop up a lot of our ideas of what society should be, which is very interesting. And this reinforces some of what I said in the last slide. Cultures usually change slowly and incrementally through change, though change can also occur very rapidly and in dramatic ways. So when change happens, usually it happens very, very, very slowly, and then unless it doesn't, right? So as with most things. So, for example, we see this in the LGBT rights movement. Whatever it called itself, over a course of about 100 years, the gay rights movement shifted and transitioned, and it was a very, 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 very slow process, right, to get acceptance and acknowledgement of LGBT people in society. It was a very slow go. But the trans rights movement, which is still active and dynamic and happening, by comparison, shifted and changed almost completely overnight, right? The way trans people were treated in the United States 10 years ago is radically different than how they are treated today. So that kind of social change, and 10 years doesn't sound like much, but for that type of social change is incredibly rapid. Yeah. And at times, a subculture can influence the mainstream and become part of the dominant culture. So as in the anti-Vietnam protesters, or something that is in the dominant culture can change into the counterculture, i.e. The Klan being acceptable, right? Being part of the Ku Klux Klan was acceptable at one time, and it is now, thankfully, part of fringe countercultural groups, and hopefully it will stay there or disappear altogether. Okay, that is my lecture for now. I hope this was relatively short. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will talk to you later.